So some of you may have access to the Adobe Creative Cloud suite, and if you do, from this point on, you're welcome to use Photoshop if you would like. There are also several other software packages that you may be already familiar with in order to create an image, but I wanted to introduce you to a free alternative to Photoshop called Photopea. If we open this, Photopea.com is a very similar software layout and tool set as what we would use in an earlier version of Photoshop. So maybe not all of the bells and whistles are here, but it's plenty enough to create a texture for our cereal box. So I'm going to go to File, Open, and it's going to look on my computer for the file. Now, the file I'm going to open is under Breakfast, Images, and it's this serialuv.png. Now, it's kind of hard to see what's happening in here. So to make it a little clearer, I'm going to create a background layer. This background layer I will put underneath layer 0, and I'll go ahead and name layer 0 UVs. And that way I can just put a solid color on this layer so I can see what's going on a little better. I can do that with the paint bucket tool, which is usually hidden underneath this gradient tool. So whatever color is in this primary box, if I click here, it will fill that with a solid color. Now again, this is a little hard to see, so let's maybe play around with this UVs layer just a little bit to make it clearer. I can go to Image, Adjustments, and Levels. And Levels is where I can adjust the brightness and contrast of this image. And if I grab this black box and slide it all the way to one side, you'll see that I'm making my layers a lot darker. Or I could do the opposite and make it a lot brighter. I'm going to go ahead and leave it white for this and hit OK. And again, just to make these a little thicker, maybe I'll right click and say duplicate this layer a few times and hit Control E to merge these layers down. You can also right click and say merge down. So now we're able to see this a little bit better, and if I hold down Alt and scroll, I can zoom in a little bit, and if I hold down the space bar, I can pan around. So if you're not super familiar with Photoshop, that's okay. Just take a little time, play around in here. Photoshop and Photopea have a lot of options that are very complex, but we're not going to be using a lot of those. For this, we're mainly going to be using it to paint and chop up some images to make our texture. So we have a solid color. We're able to see our layouts now, and we're able to paint on a new layer as well. So I don't want to mess up this layer, and my red layer is really just to give me a background so I can see stuff. So what I'm going to do is create a new layer, and you'll see now that if I choose my paintbrush, I can paint whatever colors I want to on our box. Now, obviously, we want to do something a little more robust than this. So what we're going to use is some images that I've already scanned in. A link to those images should be available on D2L. So if I minimize this, it's just a bunch of images of cereal boxes that have been scanned in. So I'm going to extract these to my current folder. Extract all. I'll go ahead and take away cereal boxes, hit extract. And what you'll see is that I get two different folders. I get inside images and outside images. So let's look at them for a second. The inside images is just the cardboard material that we would find inside of a cereal box. And I have 4 of those for you to choose for some options. The outside images are cereal box fronts that have been scanned in. So we'll see we have Captain Crunch's Peanut Butter Crunch, front and the back. Honey bunches of oats. So we have a whole bunch of different cereal types that you can use. You are also more than welcome to scan in your own cereal box or take pictures of it. You more than likely have a phone or some form of camera you could use for that. But if you don't, you're welcome to use these images as well. So I'm going to go ahead and use Captain Crunch. So personally, I would like to be able to find these images later conveniently. So I'm going to put both of these folders. I'll hit Control X to cut those, and I will paste those in my source images folder. Now this folder may start getting a little confusing, so just to make sure, I'll just create a new folder in here and call this texture work. And I'll paste these images in here. So if I want to bring one of those images into my Photopea file, I can go to File, Open and Place, and then I'll navigate to my source images folder, texture work, and I'm going to bring in some of these inside images in order to fix that part first. So I'll choose Inside 2 and hit Open, and it will bring the file in. You'll notice that it can currently be manipulated because we have these controllers around the edge. If I select this corner, I can rotate it, but if I hold Shift, I can rotate it at a 90-degree angle. I can also go up here and type in the angle I would like. I can scale it, but you want to be careful not to scale it disproportionately. One of the ways you can make it maintain its constraints, one of the ways you can make it constrain the correct proportions is by holding down Shift while you scale. And now I can go over here and kind of place it appropriately on top of our box. I'll hit Enter, and now the file is placed. Now, I do want to point out this little box around our layer. That means that it's still referring to this object as a separate object. So I want to right-click on it and just say rasterize. I don't want this to be a smart object anymore. And the reason for that is because I'm going to start erasing pixels. So I'm going to choose my eraser tool, and I'm just going to start erasing areas where I do not want this part of the box to be visible. I can resize my brush using the open and closed brackets. And then I can erase big sections of the texture. Now, if I need to erase in a straight line, I can click and hold Shift, and it'll allow me to erase in a straight line. And you'll see that since I have this layer currently selected, I can also still slide this around to make sure I'm covering all of the necessary parts of the texture. Now, you may notice that we're missing some spots. We're missing this area here, and it's still white. We also have this weird seam that's happening right here instead of maybe where we would want it. So I could put that seam where I want it, but then we're missing the seam down here. So you're capable of editing this texture to line up with whatever parts you want, but I want to show you a couple of tools that's going to make that a little easier. The first one is this clone stamp tool. The first one is the option to duplicate this object. So if I choose my move tool, I can move this object around, and if I hold down Alt and drag, it will just create a duplicate of that layer. As soon as I release it, it will make it a separate layer. So that means I can erase parts of this top layer now inside 2. And we're starting to get more appropriate coverage on the parts of the inside of the box. And then I can merge these two layers together if I would like. Right click, merge down, or Control E. Now, one of the other tools we can use is the clone stamp tool. The clone stamp tool is really nice because we can take parts of this image and paint those parts in other areas. So for example, we got this little area that's white here and does not have the correct box material on it. So I can use the clone stamp tool. I'll make my brush just a little bigger. And you'll see that here we can choose what our brush actually looks like. I want to choose a little bit of a softer brush. Now, if I hold down Alt, I can sample from one part of my box by clicking, and then paint that part somewhere else. So as I paint here, it's pulling from where I sampled and using that to paint other parts of my box. I can also use this to kind of get rid of this wrinkle or to repaint that wrinkle somewhere else. Now, one of the dangers of Photopea is that this is currently running in a browser, and I could very easily accidentally hit the back button or close down this entire browser tab. So I want to make sure that I'm able to save this. So I'm going to go to File, and I'm going to Save as a PSD. What this will do is allow me to save an actual physical file onto my computer so I can reopen it later and still retain all of the layers. So I'm going to go ahead and leave this in texture work and call this serial texture. Got to turn off my caps lock and hit save. Interestingly, that file we just saved will also open in Photoshop and several other photo editing programs and still retain the layers. So now the next part is a little bit more challenging. We need to piece together our serial box front, and this part is a little more nuanced in terms of the images. So let's bring in a couple of other images again with opened and place. I'm going to choose Captain Crunch 1. And I'll go ahead and rotate that around. Hold down Shift to rotate 90-degree increments or 15-degree increments. And I'll go ahead and scale it down to something closer to our box size. And then I'm just going to kind of move it over here to get it out of the way and hit enter. I'm also going to go ahead and open and place the back of the box as well, just so I have them both in the scene. Again, hold Shift to rotate in 15-degree increments. Hold Shift while I scale it down and get it close to the right size. I'm not going to be too perfect with this because we're going to do some more work in a minute. Again, I need to rasterize both of these layers. So I'll right click and say rasterize, and I'll right click here and say rasterize. Now this next part is going to get a little more complicated. I'm going to hide layer 2. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut out parts of this image and separate them and use that to piece together my box exterior. I'm going to do that with a new tool. We can select parts of an image with our different selection tools. So with our rectangle selection tool, if I were to drag here, I've selected this upper corner of layer CC1. And if I move this, you'll see that it'll chop off that layer. But I want to select a very specific area. And so I'm going to use a different selection tool called the Polygon Lasso tool. So that's going to be under this little lasso. We go down and it's in the middle. Now the way this works is that I can click individual points and start to make my selection. So I just need 4 points to get the whole front of this box. I can hold down spacebar while in the middle of this to reposition if necessary. And actually, I'm going to go ahead and select this bottom tab as well. I didn't really need that part. I didn't really need that part, but I can fix that later. And then when I'm done, I can get up here to the very end and click near this, and it makes our selection. And what I'm going to do is hit Control C, and then in that new layer I made, I will move it up and hit Control V. So now I can hide layer CC1, and you'll see that I just have the front of my cereal box pasted into that new layer. This will allow me to reposition this cereal box and change the layer in a way that fits with my current cereal box proportions. Again, this is the whole layer, so I can actually just go to the Move tool now, or just deselect by clicking the Selection tool and clicking off somewhere. And so now I'm just moving the entire layer, not just my selection. Now if I need to scale this, it works a little bit differently than in Photoshop. I just go to the Transform controls, and you'll see that I can start to scale this and position it a little more appropriately to my cereal box. I'm going to prioritize the front of this box looking correctly over everything else. And then I can hit Enter or uncheck my transform controls. Now again, I didn't necessarily need this, that was a mistake, so I can just erase that part off. Now again, this bottom part isn't fully covered, but I'll fix that a little bit later. Now one of the things I want to notice is that this color of our Captain Crunch box is not the same color as our background. It's close, but it's not exact. So what I'm going to do is select this color of the box and go ahead and fill my background color with that color. I can do that by using this eyedropper. If I click the eyedropper and then click somewhere on my image, you'll see that this color is now the color of my cereal box. Now I can go back to my layer 1 and fill that with the same orange color. And that's going to help a little bit with integrating this into a single image. From here, we're just going to repeat these steps with the layer in order to piece together our entire cereal box. I'll time lapse this next part so it doesn't get too boring to watch. Okay, so we're done with all the manipulation now. I would like to flatten all of this into a single layer and then use the clone stamp tool to fix some of the weird little creases and areas where the color isn't lining up perfectly. Okay, so now there's only one more step to do. We're going to turn off our UVs. We're going to go ahead and save this file again as the PSD. And we're going to export this as an image we could use for a texture. So I'll just go to File, Export as PNG. I'll leave all of these settings default and hit Save. And I'm going to save this in my Source Images folder as Serial Color. Now the reason for this is because later I may want to make another map for the serial's reflection map or the serial's specular map. So this is the serial color map. And I'll hit Save. And so again, it's important to remember to turn off the UVs so those lines don't show up on our model. So now when we go back to Maya, I can apply that texture to my current AI standard surface materials color. Of course, I'll name this Serial Matte, because apparently I forgot to do that earlier. And under color, I'll choose this checkerboard. I'll go to File, and I'll choose Serial Color. It's the image we just saved out. And when I hit Open, all of the elements will line up in our UV editor, and because of that, they will also all line up on our serial box. So now we have a much more realistic scene with some realistic textures. It's important to recognize that not everything in the scene has to be UV'd in this way, but some elements would probably look much better if they were, such as the milk carton, the table, and maybe even the mug. So when I render this now, our texture is showing up on our serial box. It's also important to remember that texture isn't everything. Our serial box also has reflectivity and glossiness. So even though this texture is looking okay, I don't necessarily want my serial box to be super reflective. So I may want to go in and turn down my specular to get rid of a little bit of that reflectivity and just have a little bit of gloss or shininess on the surface.